What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video, and welcome back to my backyard. This is part number 2 of this shed build series, the last part of the series. If you missed part number 1, I'll have a link to that so you can go check that out. But in part number 2, I'm going to cover getting all of the trim added to the shed, doing all of the roofing work, building these doors, getting the whole thing painted, and then finally building this ramp. Also, before we get started with this video, I want to give another big shout out to Heart Tools, who sponsored this series. Could not have done this without their support. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the project. So next on the list was getting the roof sheathing on, and I used 1/2" OSB for this. And I got the first sheet up onto the roof with the help of my ever helpful wife, and then I added a few screws to hold it in place before I climbed up on the roof and added some more screws. After adding the first sheet, I measured for the second sheet I'd need to add, cut it off camera, and then dropped it in place and got it screwed down. With the roof sheathing on, I could go ahead and cut the excess siding off, and I left it long up until now so that the siding would act as a guide for that first sheet of OSB when sliding it up onto the roof. I marked a line on the siding using a level just below the surface of the roof sheathing, set my circular saw blade to cut slightly deeper than the siding, and then cut to my line. And this was definitely a little awkward just due to how sloped the ground was in this spot, but I got it cut down eventually. After cutting down the siding, I could go back and add filler pieces to the gable fascia at the two ends, to act as spacers for the fascia trim I'd be adding next. Speaking of which, next I could get the 1x6 trim added to the fascias, and this was one spot where the plans I had used were incorrect, as the plans call for 8-foot long pieces of trim, but since this trim has to span the roof framing and the siding, I actually needed 8-foot 1-inch long pieces here for the eave fascia trim. This wasn't a huge deal as I needed to leave gaps at the ends of this trim for expansion anyway based on the manufacturer's instructions, but these gaps were a little bit larger than I'd like, but nothing a bunch of caulk won't hide. I repeated the process adding the fascia trim to the back of the shed, which was again extremely awkward just due to how close this was to the house, and then I could get the gable fascia trim added. And the ends of this trim are cut to that same 18.5-degree angle the rafter tails were cut to in the last video, and I cut these pieces at the miter saw. And after getting the trim fit, the trim was installed with more 2.5-inch screws. So typically at this point you just continue adding the rest of the trim to the shed, but I decided to skip ahead to the roofing with that fascia trim on as we were set for multiple days of rain and I wanted to get the shed dried in. The first thing to add here was a drip edge to the front edge of the roof, and I needed to cut and bend the drip edge around the front corners of the fascia. To fasten the drip edge, I used some 1 1/4" roofing nails and added nails every foot or so through the drip edge into the roof sheathing and subfascia. The next thing to add was some felt roofing underlayment, which acts as another barrier between the elements and the roof sheathing. And I attached this with more roofing nails, although plastic cap nails are the more traditional choice here. I just didn't have any on hand. Once the felt paper was on, I measured for more drip edge for the gable fascia, cut it to length, and nailed it on, overlapping the felt paper and front drip edge. I repeated the same process on the other side of the shed, and then I could prep for adding shingles by snapping some reference chalk lines every foot going up the roof. And this felt paper actually already had lines on it, but due to the hefty overlap on my felt paper, they didn't really line up with the shingles as they went higher on the roof. With that, I was ready to get to adding shingles, and I first needed to make some starter strips, which helped the first full row of shingles stick to the roof. To make my starter strips, I just cut a few pieces of shingles in half lengthwise along the tar strip, and then I cut one of the starter strips down by 6 inches to get a sufficient offset from the first row of shingles. Next, I could get the starter strips installed on the roof, making sure to have them overhanging over the edges of the drip edge by 3/8 of an inch on both edges. I used nails to attach the strip, and each strip and shingle needs nails spaced every foot, with 1 nail at each end and 2 spaced evenly in the center. After adding the starter strips, I cut the end off of the overhanging strip, making sure to leave that same 3/8 inch overhang, and then I could add my first strip of shingles. And notice anything wrong here? So somehow in my haste to get these shingles on before the rain came, I completely spaced and installed the entire first row of shingles upside down. After realizing my mistake, I decided to just go with it and installed my actual row of shingles on top of my mistake row, and I figured the roof will just be double protected in this area. Anyway, the first row of shingles started with a full shingle and ended with an overhanging piece, which I cut down with a utility knife using another shingle as a straight edge. And if I could give you one tip when installing shingles, it's to have plenty of extra utility knife blades on hand. I only had one blade left here at the house, and it was incredibly dull on both ends by the time I got about halfway up this roof, and it made cutting the shingles much more difficult. The second row of shingles is offset from the first row by 6 inches so that the flaps on the second row are centered between the flaps on the first row, and the process just continues up the roof from here. And as you can see, I screwed up again by having a larger offset on the third row and spaced it too far, but I was able to just fill this in and continue up the roof. And as I continued up the roof, I would restart a row with a full shingle after 6 rows, and I could fill in those offset areas on the right side of the roof with offcuts from the left side, so I was able to use the shingles really efficiently. Of course, I ran out of nails right before that last row, so I had to run back out to the store. But once I got the last row installed, which was a half row in my case, I could add a wider drip edge along the top edge of the roof. To seal this piece, since it will be more exposed to the elements, I added some roofing sealant to the underside of the drip edge and then nailed it in place. With that, the roof was done and the shed was dried in, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. Roofing is definitely a pain, but it pays to install it well, especially when you can see the roof easily, like you can see this roof from our deck, which overlooks this shed. So now that the shed was dried in, I could move back to that trim install, and the next pieces to install prior to the corner trim were a few pieces to cover the soffits on the underside of the rafters. I used some scrap pieces of siding for this, which worked out perfectly, and I installed them by screwing them onto the subfascia. In reality, these need to be screwed to the rafters instead, so that the soffit pieces angle upwards, as otherwise there won't be enough room for the trim above the door opening, which I found out a little later. Next, I got the corner trim installed, starting with one of the pieces on the sides of the shed. And these need to have a matching angle cut onto one end to match up with the Gable Fascia trim, but as long as everything was built correctly, this should again be that same 18.5 degree angle that we've become so familiar with at this point. After cutting the piece to length of the miter saw, I could get it installed on the shed, and as I mentioned previously, this particular trim needs a 3/16 of an inch gap left anywhere it butts up to another piece of trim. Luckily, my speed square is exactly 3/16 of an inch thick, so I used it as a spacer and used an offcut piece of trim to help align the piece I was installing with the front face of the shed. I installed the trim with more 2.5 inch screws, and then I could continue adding the rest of the trim around the shed. And the corner trim on the front and back faces of the shed need to be notched around the Gable Fascia trim, which I did with my jigsaw, but otherwise the rest of the trim is fairly straightforward to install. While I'm adding the trim, I want to take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Hart Tools. So Hart Tools is a new line of tools sold exclusively by Walmart, and their main focus is providing a great quality tool at a great value. So as you've seen, I've used nothing but Hart tools on this build, and I've got to say, I think they're perfect for the DIYer or weekend warrior. These tools have got plenty of power for all of your home improvement and DIY projects. They have pretty much every tool you might need in their 20-volt lineup, so you can have everything on the same battery platform, and Hart even has a 40-volt line of lawn and garden tools, including a mower and chainsaw, which you'll see later in this video. If you want to learn more about all the Hart tools I used in this video, check out the links in the video description below, and again, big thanks to Hart Tools for sponsoring this shed build series. After getting the trim added to the front corners and the door opening, I added the trim to the back corners, and I decided to change things up a bit here and use some of that leftover 1x6 trim from the fascias at these back corners. And I had ended up with a bunch of extra screw holes here by adding the screws in the wrong place when adding the siding, and I wanted to cover those up, and these 1x6s were really perfect for this. So with that, the trim was done, so I could move on to building and installing the doors on the shed. To assemble the doors, I first attached these OSB pieces to the 2x4 framework that makes up the core of the door using some 1 5/8" trim head screws. I actually ended up cutting up the remaining OSB from the roof sheathing for the inside faces of these doors, rather than going out and buying another whole sheet of OSB for this, and this worked out great and left me with essentially no wasted OSB. And I made sure to check for square frequently here, as the last thing I wanted was an out of square door that wouldn't fit in my door opening, but after locking in the squareness, I came back and added a bunch more screws for reinforcement. Next, I flipped the door over and dropped on the front face, which is more of the siding. And this is actually the offcut from the siding on the front of the shed, and this design makes really efficient use of these siding pieces with very little waste. The siding is oriented on the front face of the door so that it overhangs the edges of the door on all 4 sides, at least on this right door, and that overhang will overlap the left door, keeping it locked in place. Getting this overhang just right on all of the edges definitely takes a little adjusting, but once I had the placement dialed in, I attached the siding to the door with more trim head screws. The last pieces to add to the door were more trim pieces, which both made the door look nicer, but also beefed up the edges and center of the door, which gave the hinges something more substantial to attach through. And I added the trim with more 2.5 inch screws. And here's the left door just to show you how the siding and trim are offset from the 2x4 framing here, which is where that right door will overlap and lock the door in place. I took the left door out to the shed before installing the hinges, but I wised up on the right door and installed the hinges while the door was on my workbench, which was a lot easier. So I centered the hinge on the trim and then pre-drilled the holes using a self-centering drill bit to keep the screws from causing the hinge to shift when I added them. Also, you might notice that the center screw holes fall over the 2x4 framing, but I needed to angle the 3-inch screws near the edge of the door to make sure they hit the framing. I repeated the process for the other 2 hinges and then brought the door out to the shed for installation. And before installation, I added a piece of 1/2-inch plywood to act as a spacer below the door to help center the door in the door opening. Next, I set the door in place and then added some 1/4-inch plywood spacers between the right side of the door and the door opening, again to help center it. With the spacing dialed in, I could attach the other side of the hinges to the shed using more 3-inch screws. And these screws go into the door opening framing and create an extremely strong door that should really resist sagging over time. After adding 1 screw in each hinge, I removed the spacers and tested the door to make sure it swung freely, which it did, so I could add the rest of the screws to lock it in place. I repeated the process for the left door, which went really smoothly, and then the doors were installed and working great. Next, I needed to add some hardware to lock the doors in their closed position, starting with a few barrel latches on the left door. I installed these on both the bottom and top corners of the inside of the door with more 2.5-inch screws, and the latches were installed flush with the bottom edge of the door. After attaching the latch to the door, I closed the door fully and traced around where the barrel contacted the floor, then drilled out a hole in this location. And I needed to enlarge this hole ever so slightly so the fit wasn't too snug, but once I did that, the latch was functioning really well, and I repeated the same process at the top of the door off camera. To hold the right door in place, I added a latch where I can add a padlock to secure the door. I centered the latch on the doors and also made sure to use 2.5-inch screws rather than the included screws so that the latch was securely attached to the door framing. I decided to move on with painting the shed next. I first needed to prep for paint, and I started by trimming this little overlap between the fascia trim boards. I think I was supposed to install the eave fascia trim boards a little lower, but my oscillating multi-tool made quick work of cutting the overhanging piece flush. While I was at it, I switched over to a sanding pad on the multi-tool and softened those edges along with the front edge of the floor. I figured that removing the doors would make painting a little easier, which I definitely think it did, and it only took a minute or two to remove them and then set them up on some sawhorses for painting. Next came the very time-consuming process of caulking all of the joints and screw holes, and as I mentioned when installing this trim, I ended up with a much larger gap than I wanted between these fascia trim boards. To avoid having to use an entire tube of caulk here, I added a bit of foam backing rod, which I could just stuff into that joint, and this gave something for the caulk to sit against and made it much easier to get a clean seam here. I repeated the same process at the other end, and then I could start caulking all of the screw holes, which there were quite a few of, but luckily this went pretty quickly. I just added a glob to each screw hole and then evened it out with the surface of the siding or trim with my finger. And because both the siding and the trim have a wood texture, this process is really pretty forgiving, and the paint made the majority of these holes disappear. I also needed to caulk the rest of the butt joints, where I had to leave those 3/16-inch gaps. I of course ran out of my first tube of caulk here filling this huge joint, and I definitely used quite a bit filling all of these large gaps. I also caulked the seam where the siding met up with the trim, which makes for a really nice finished look. And I did this on both the shed and on the doors. Once the caulking was done, I could move on to paint, first painting the trim white. I used Total Boat Elixir paint on the shed, and you might have seen me use this paint on previous projects. Elixir is a water-based enamel paint, so it's super durable, it dries really quickly, and it has almost no fumes. And I'll link to the exact paint colors I used in the video description below in case you're interested. I started by applying paint to the trim on the door with a brush, and I wasn't really worried about overlapping the siding at this point as I'd be painting that green. I repeated the same process for the fascia trim, making sure to get paint under the drip edge and on the cut ends of the fascia trim, as they need to be really well sealed. After applying 3 coats on the trim, I could tape off the trim to prep for adding the green paint. And I ended up being extremely disappointed with how this particular tape worked, as you'll see in a bit, so I definitely recommend investing in some really good quality painter's tape for a project like this. After taping, I rolled on the green paint onto the door panels and then cut in with a brush around the trim. And I definitely tried adding way too much paint per coat here, which caused the paint to pool up on the tape and caused me some problems later, which you'll see. I repeated the same process on the shed, and you'll notice that I decided to paint the majority of the trim the same green color as the body of the shed. I actually tried out some different color options in SketchUp, and I thought that having all of the trim painted white made the shed look really busy, and I really like how painting the majority of the trim green made it kind of blend in with the siding. It also meant a lot less taping, which was a bonus. And you can see that this first coat definitely looked a little rough, but after 3 coats, the color looked great. Unfortunately, when I went to remove the tape from the doors, I realized that I had added way too much paint, which had dried on top of the tape, causing the tape to actually pull off some of the paint from the doors.
Dude, no! Oh my god.
The paint also ended up seeping under the tape, which I blame on the crappy painter's tape. This was definitely really frustrating after spending a day and a half prepping and painting the shed, but it looks fine from afar and is good enough for a storage shed. The last major part of this shed build was adding a ramp so that we can roll items in and out of the shed easily. And I had mocked up a ramp in SketchUp, but honestly, it's probably best to just cut your pieces on site, as you'll see. First, I measured out where I thought the ramp would land in front of the shed and dug out that area so that I could add some gravel. Before actually adding the gravel, I figured I would cut one of the stringers for the ramp just to make sure it would work, and I marked out my layout lines on a pressure-treated 2x6, which I used for the stringers and the ledger board for this ramp, and then I cut the long angled section of the stringer with my circular saw. I cut the other angled end of the stringer at the miter saw, then test fit the stringer, realizing that it was way too short for this shed just due to how the ground slopes away from the shed here. So I called an audible and cut another stringer about a foot longer, just kind of totally guessing, using the opposite side of the stringer I had just cut, and this looked a lot better. Finally, I could dial in the angle where the stringer met up with the shed with some test cutting at the miter saw. Once I had that dialed in, I could trace that corrected stringer shape onto the rest of my boards, and I was able to nest them together so that long angled section only had to be cut once for each pair of stringers. I cut the stringers to rough length with the circular saw, and then I cut them to their final length at the miter saw, using that same angle I had found previously. And because of my audible call, I actually ended up with more stringers than I needed, but I figured this would just make for a much stronger ramp. I marked out locations for the stringers and added 3 3-inch screws per connection, which made for an extremely sturdy ramp. Unfortunately, when I was laying out the stringer spacing on the ledger board, I screwed up my math a little bit and accidentally laid out locations for one too many stringers, which I didn't realize until about halfway through assembling the ramp. Not a huge deal, I just split the difference between the last 2 stringers I had installed and called it good, as the spacing was still tighter than your typical 16 inches on center. With the ramp framing built, next I moved it into place temporarily to mark where it landed in the yard, so that I could dig out the area a little more to accommodate this longer ramp. So I dug out the area, added a few bags of gravel, and got the gravel roughly leveled before dragging the ramp back into place and getting 1 screw added to hold the ramp in place. And the ledger board here needed to be 1.5 inches below the surface of the shed floor so that the 1-inch thick deck boards could be added and the doors could still close. After adding that first screw, I just made sure the ramp was level and then added more 3-inch screws to tie the ramp into the floor framing. Next, I could spread around the gravel a bit more just to make sure it was nice and even beneath the stringers, and then I added more gravel between the stringers to help keep the ramp in place securely. Unfortunately, I of course forgot to reframe my shot before doing this, but here's how the ramp looked after adding more gravel. So as I mentioned, I used 5/4 pressure treated deck boards for the surface of the ramp, so next I got those cut to length at the miter saw, and I made my ramp 4 feet wide, so I got 3 pieces out of each 12-foot board. The last board at the very bottom of the ramp needed to be ripped to width, and I did this with my circular saw, and I also added a slight bevel just to make it easier for items to roll onto the ramp. With all my boards cut to size, next I could pre-drill holes into the treads, first marking the stringer locations on the back edges of the boards. I pre-drilled and countersunk 2 holes at each stringer location in each board. I used this little tip I picked up from my buddy John Peters to make sure the holes all had even spacing. Basically, you mark out your hole locations on a piece of painter's tape on your speed square, and then just line up your drill bit with these marks before drilling. And this keeps you from having to mark and measure each hole location, and it also has the added benefit of avoiding having a bunch of layout lines left on the face of your boards. Anyway, after pre-drilling, I could get the boards added to the ramp, which went extremely quickly with the holes already pre-drilled, and I added the first few boards and then went ahead and added the very last board just to make sure my stringers were oriented nice and square to the ledger board. Finally, I hit the edges of the ramp with that sanding pad on the oscillating multi-tool so that my little guy doesn't get any splinters when he inevitably plays on this ramp, and then I could call this ramp done, and I could call the shed done.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this shed build series. I'm really happy with the way it all came together, and it's actually really fun to build a structure like this just because of how quickly it goes together. So again, if this is your first time to the channel, I'd love it if you'd go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. Also, I'll have links to all of those Hart tools as well as all the materials I use down in the video description below. And last, while you're here, why not go ahead and check out this video that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.